again, God did for me what I couldn't do for myself, because I really felt God's prompt to call a certain friend, and I did, and I poured out the story. And she came and sat with me on my kitchen floor that day and listened to the story. And she was the first one that told me I was a sexual abuse victim, because she'd known my family for 20 years. And through her influence, got into counseling, did some very intense counseling work the first couple of years, went back to school and got a master's degree, began counseling other people, and eventually that began Bethesda Workshops, and kind of here I am today. It took me a hellacious year to get sober and stay sober. I don't recommend that at all. But the reason is that I refused to be involved in any kind of support system. I refused to go to 12-step meetings. There weren't any supports like this, certainly not for, there weren't for men at that point, but there certainly weren't for females who struggle with sex addiction. Until one day I was eating breakfast with this affair partner, because I thought, oh, well, we can still be friends, right, if we don't have sex? I mean, of course not. But he was the only one I would let into my life. And I see the obituary of a former affair partner died of AIDS. And I had run into him a year before. I'd acted out with him in my first marriage. And frankly, I did everything I knew to do to get him to be sexual with me, and he wouldn't. And finally, he literally patted me on the head in the mall. It was Christmas time, and said, go home, get your shit together. That's what he said. What you're doing will kill you. 9 months later, died of AIDS. And that day, August the 8th, 1992, I went to my first 12-step meeting. I certainly haven't done recovery perfectly at all. I'm an imperfect person. And there have been times I would say I wasn't sober. There's certainly been lots more times that I wasn't well, but I've always pursued and kept after recovery, and the healing just goes deeper and deeper. And what recovery means just goes deeper and deeper and deeper with every single passing day, and certainly with every passing year. I've learned so much from my own journey. I'm so blessed to be able to help other people through Bethesda Workshops. That's so important to me. And Jay and I had agreed we would talk some about kind of stages of recovery. And so I'll just start that conversation with saying, I think for all of us, that first stage, and it is, I view it a beginning stage of recovery, is that complete unmanageability. That idea, I cannot keep doing what I'm doing. And it's a painful place but ultimately, as the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the pain of changing, is the ushering into recovery. I think those early stages, well, first is that withdrawal. I don't know if this happens to men as much as I hear this from women all the time, but withdrawal was hell from that affair partner. Certain not just sexual withdrawal, but just all the emotion, all the stuff that was involved in that was extraordinarily difficult. And I hear that. All the surrender that comes within that, which was, there were 2 or 3 really big deal times for me of surrender. Very, they felt very dramatic times. The events themselves weren't particularly dramatic, but huge breakthroughs as God got through to me more. So that, of course, that's still an ongoing process. It's just surrendering different things today, but that's such a part of the process. But grieving is such a part of that process. Grieving for the loss of the addiction, because it's been our friend. It has helped us survive. I believe that framework with all my heart. And to be without that coping mechanism and without that best friend is very difficult. Of course, grieving how we've hurt other people, grieving all of the losses, that immersion in early recovery. Just, I did 90 meetings in 90 days for sure. I did for years, went to 3 to 5 meetings a week. Again, there was no support like this. So we're talking about either SLAA or primarily SA happened to be the fellowships in the area where I was doing just all the counseling, all of those kinds of things. You know, there comes working on sobriety. and then working on all the trauma work, all the deeper stuff that's underneath our addictions. This is not just about sex. I'm sure you guys know that. This is about stuff so, so, so much deeper than sex. For me, it was the desperate need to be seen, to be attended to be loved, to be nurtured, to have somebody say you matter, to have someone spend time with me. Those are wholly legitimate desires. And yet, when they're not met, when we're left to meet them in our own devices, we do that really poorly. So to do all the trauma work about all of that. There's a stabilization part. Often this is where good relationship repair happens if two people are willing to do that work. All the rebuilding. I think many of us, maybe we've started earlier in recovery doing some kind of service work, maybe just making the coffee or setting up chairs, but different kinds, sponsorship and those kinds of things at that stage. And then the really deeper work, the deeper work for the trauma, for strengthening that inner circle of people. That was a big part of my recovery, was to connect with other women, which I had never done in my life. So that strengthening, that solidifying, that solidifying integrity, that it's about so much more than sexual integrity. This is such a bigger construct and a deeper kind of thing. And through all of that, I think it's at this point, spirituality is a part through every single stage. But for me, at least at this stage, spirituality got just really sweet. It wasn't that just desperation, God, help me, help me, help me. It became genuinely a relationship. And then long term, the later stage, for me, it's about legacy. It's about redemption. It's about having perspective for the journey, for life, for other people, compassion for myself and for other people. So I've been on this journey for 29 years, and I'm so grateful for it. And I'm always glad to be in connection and get to spend some time even on Zoom with other people for whom recovery is important and matters.
Thank you, Marnie. Very powerful story is yours. I want to pick up on one of the points you mentioned, because I think it's one that is pretty pervasive in recovery, and that's the whole idea of this kind of emotional intensity, the kind of the brain chemicals, the brain cocktail that often gets established at a young age, and the intensity of addiction, which sometimes has to do with the pursuit, the secrecy, with all the stuff that's around it. You mentioned some of the emotionalism, and I would say still today that there's part of me that still wants that, still has some kind of attachment to it, and doesn't know how to quite get it out of my brain. And so, can you talk about more specifically about that whole withdrawal process from the emotional intensity and the brain chemistry that's so much a part of addiction?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the reason, and I can't get away from that either, you know, that might be not encouraging to y'all, but it's an honesty program. So there you go. But I think it's because, Jay, those are core legitimate desires. Maybe Debbie Laser next week will talk about the 7 desires of the heart that she and Mark Laser, dear colleagues and friends, have identified. Those are legitimate desires. And I think some of all that emotionality that is so intriguing to us and that still is such a pull is because that's how God made us. There's a lot of brain chemistry information about that Kirk can explain. Kirk Thompson makes sense to me when I hear somebody like him or others explain it, but I can't articulate it myself. But the real thing, I'm a clinician, so if we're coming at it from a minute from a clinical standpoint, these are attachment breaches. This is all about attachment. This is about relationship. This is about genuine intimacy, into me see, and to see into someone else. And those things are just core to our human experience. That's how God wired us. It's what makes us hungry for God. And so some of this withdrawal, I think, is just realizing I will never get those needs met, certainly not in that intense and high emotionality way that we do in addiction or in acting out or in secret sexual or emotional liaisons. I'm not ever going to get that met this side of heaven. I not to the extent that our human heart deeply desires. Now, there's obviously a continuum about that, and it can get so much better, particularly if there's a partner, in y'all's case, a wife who is willing to do recovery, and there can be repair within the coupleship. But there's some part of that, I think, is a holy longing that is always going to be there. But when you've medicated it so well, because in the short term and actually kind of in the long term with these long-term affairs, it keeps working for a long time until it blows up. But when you've met it like that and scratch that itch so much and it feels so good because it's a holy desire, and the body doesn't know that you're meeting it in a unhealthy way. Now, I think the spirit and the soul knows that, and mentally we come to know that, spiritually we come to know that. But when you met it so well, and then you're without it, it's like, oh, holy cow! This is a huge. This is the big detox. The same way your body is going to crave cocaine or heroin or alcohol. It's the same physiological process. And it is very difficult.
Yeah. So let's talk about the workshop, because we've had a number of people, men and women, I believe, have been to your workshops from Northeast Florida. And my question is, why is a workshop a wise choice for somebody to sign up for? We know there's a cost involved. And at what point, what's the best time to go to a workshop?
Oh, yeah, thanks. I love talking about our workshops. I think every single person can benefit from an intensive. I think it's in the best interest of every single person. Sometimes people say, well, I'm not bad enough. I don't really need to go to an intensive. Meaning my acting out hasn't been that bad. Maybe it's been just pornography or just masturbation or something. So why do I need an intensive? An intensive will jumpstart your recovery a year. Now that's a big deal. It will help that withdrawal period because you immediately will get a deep band of brothers. Again, I'll speak about our Healing for Men program for male sex addicts. You immediately get connected in an extraordinarily deep way because it's an immersion thing, very quickly, deeply connected with other men. Well, if sex addiction is an intimacy disorder, the solution is healthy intimacy, biggest part of the solution. And so to have those people, you get lots and lots of education about addiction. Just looking at the clock, the time that you're spending, it's the equivalent of 8 to 12 months of weekly individual therapy. It just accelerates all of that. And so it's kind of the difference between cutting the dog's tail off an inch at a time and just whack, here we go, which, by the way, I happen to believe is a barbaric process, but it's still, that's the analogy. To do this all up front, and then your meetings and the support group and being in things like Living Without Lust and 12-step S fellowships and even counseling, all of those are already starting from a way up here place. And you can really unpack all the stuff that you learned. It's actually more cost effective. I know that people are like, oh my goodness, I can't spend, $2,500, $3,000 for an in-person workshop or $1,600, $1,800 for an online workshop. I mean, my goodness. And I go, dude or woman, come on. How much money have you spent acting out? Or how much unproductive time have you spent acting out? So you're worth it. But even just doing the math, I don't find that people can recover without the help of a good counselor. I just think at some point, everybody needs to have a season of counseling. Well, at $150 a pop, $3,000, it doesn't take long to get up to that. And in a workshop, you're getting all of that in 4 days, and it actually will save you in counseling on the back end. I think for addicts, again, men for your part, it's a um, huge step for your wives to see, I am willing to come off the grid, to take vacation days or sick days or whatever away from my job if I'm working, um, to submit to this process, to learn from the experts, and to do this big deal thing with lots of accountability. And it's a huge boost for wives to say, you know what, he gets this. He is serious about this. So there are all kinds of reasons that I think everybody benefits. Ideally, kind of sooner rather than later, meaning relatively early, when you're starting to realize my life is unmanageable, that's the time to do it. But we have men who have been sober for 2-3 years, who come and find that still just the intensity of being in that setting, and especially to do the trauma work, to look at the family of origin wounds, to do those kinds of pieces, to look at the spirituality and addiction, is still really, really helpful. So there's not a bad time to come.
Mm, thank you. We're going to get to your questions in about 15 or 20 minutes. So if you have one and it's on the top of your mind, just put it on the chat function and we'll pick it up when we get to the open question um, point of the interview. So Marnie, I want to ask you, is there any difference in marriage recovery, because we talk about our own individual recovery, then the recovery of the marriage, when the woman is the sex addict versus when the man is the sex addict? Are there different dynamics at work from each, or are they essentially the same dynamics?
I think they're the same dynamics. Um, I think it doesn't matter who the addict is, that the process is generally going to be the same. Um, that ideally healthy recovery looks like the addict person is doing his or her own work. I'll use male pronouns because that's what we have here. You are doing your work. Certainly sobriety, nothing good happens without sobriety. The deeper work, the work of community like you're doing, and your wife is doing her work. Now, the beginning of that work, and I'm sure Debbie probably and Michelle both will talk about partners a whole lot more, but the beginning of all that work is the deep pain of the betrayal that we as addicts do. And that's just enormous. But ultimately, looking at some of their own coping, looking at some of the own woundedness maybe they brought into the relationship that makes it hard for them to set boundaries with you, or hard for them to show up in the relationship. And then there's a couples work that's going as well. So it's a three, Mark and Debbie Laser always called it, it's the three-legged stool of the addict's recovery, the partner's recovery, and this coupleship recovery. Is what that looks like. And it doesn't really matter the genders.
Now, you mentioned the early part, which is, the betrayal, some of the revelations of what's been happening and so on. And I remember that I had the only 2 panic attacks I had was when I moved into an apartment, lost my job. I was a pastor. Moved out from my wife and family, didn't know how I was going to make a living. And I had 2 panic attacks. But there are many of us who go through places in recovery where we think, I'm not sure I can see how this is going to work out. I don't, can you talk some about any of those moments in your life when you just felt either lost or in despair, and how you found the hope to carry on and see it through to a better place?
I mean, those moments are legion. They still happen today around COVID, around the impact it has on Bethesda Workshops, around some other things, different things in my life. I think that's what faith is about. The substance of things not seen. It's not faith if you already know for sure the end of the story in terms of your own life. And recovery is certainly like that. I probably can't quote the White Book from SA perfectly, but there's something in there about, we couldn't see the path ahead and every step felt like stepping off into oblivion, and yet we took it because others had gone before us. I think that's true for all of us. There's so many steps that feel like that. Everything is falling apart. I love a quote from a Western author writes American Western novels, Louis L'Amour, who says, there will come a point where everything is over. That will be the beginning. And I love that. That's such a thing of recovery. And so how did I get through those? A lot of it is just perseverance and grit, of just truly narrowing the focus to right now, what can I do? What's my next right thing? Maybe it's to go brush my teeth. Maybe it's to take the dog out. Maybe it's to answer this email from work. That keeping the focus on what I can control, which is what I'm doing right here in this moment, and letting go of all the rest, that's of course so hard. But then I've also found a sweet truth of God so showing up for me, and in really incredible ways. I mean, again, my friend coming that day and having the wisdom to say the things that she said was absolutely God showing up for me, but in very small ways. I see completely God showing up. I'll tell you, just, it sounds really silly, but I blog through Bethesda Workshops, and sometime back in the summer, I wrote a blog called Consolation of the Hawks, Red-tailed Hawks. Hawks have come to be very meaningful to me this year. And I live in a very residential, standard suburban type neighborhood, though there are lots of mature trees and things. And I started noticing a hawk that would appear and would perch on top of a steeple. I live across the street from a church that has this beautiful steeple. And it's just been astonishing to me. I've cataloged it. The times that I have felt, even this year, just discouraged and disappointed and frightened about the future in terms of the health of the people I love, in terms of Bethesda Workshops and the enormous impact COVID has had on us when we can't have in-person workshops and different things, that I would be praying and I would see a hawk. And I've come to call them Mama God, Papa God, because there are two or three that appear pretty regularly, and I can actually tell them apart. And even just this morning, as I was taking my dog for a walk and praying, knowing that I was going to share with y'all, and I looked up, and on the steeple, there was Mama God Hawk saying, you have something that could be of help to these people. So that's a practice of being really present right here in the moment, and looking for God. When we look for God, God is always there, and we will see God's hand. And sometimes it's just so sweet and very specific like that. Not miraculous, at least it hasn't been for me. There's nothing miraculous about a red-tailed hawk. It's the most prevalent, one of the most prevalent birds in our part of the country. But just, I've never noticed them before. And so God seems to just give us hope and to show up for us at those times we are so desperate and needed.
So I think I speak for a bunch of us when I talk about the difficulty in a marriage when I am in recovery and my spouse is not giving me any room. My spouse is not giving me any credit. My spouse says, I don't really care. My spouse is not changing. I'll just use her attitude
Sure.
toward me. And I'm kind of waiting for something to happen. What are some of the do's and don'ts for that period? Because I mean, the joke is around SA and other fellowships that, some newcomers come in and they say, well, it's been 3 months, and she said she forgave me, but, nothing's happening. When is she going to get over it? And we often say, well, how long have you been acting out? Well, about 27 years.
Yeah.
And she's going to get over it in 3 months. How do we navigate through that patience? And how do we focus on the right things before the deeper healing begins, often after we expect it?
Yeah. That's absolutely true. I actually co-wrote a book about that called Out of the Doghouse for Christian Men. A colleague had written one, a very secular version, and he invited me to Christianify it, which I loved doing. And so all the core material belongs to Dr. Rob Weiss. But humility is so important. Now, addicts and humility, we don't go together very well. at all. And so that's something we have to be taught. That's a process of surrender, but to stay humble, to stay focused again on the addict side. What can I control? Today, I can control whether or not I'm in sobriety. I mean, it's uncontrollable and unmanageable when in active addiction, but there comes a point today I can certainly make the healthy choices that are going to ascertain that I'm going to stay in sobriety today. And that's all I can do. And I think, again, a support system is so helpful about that, because you need other people who are your cheerleaders, who are saying, rah, rah, you just picked up a 90-day chip. That's so great for you. And keep going, brother, you're doing it. But your wife is not going to be the one to give that to you. And nor should she. Certainly not early like that. So staying immersed in the program, being in a meeting every day through those kinds of hard things. Again, it's one benefit of COVID. By now with Zoom, you can go to multiple meetings every single day. Yeah. And so that's wonderful. So just those practical, just working your heart out in standard recovery practices. And staying humble and patient with your wife's pain. But Out of the Doghouse for Christian Men, it's on the front page of our website. You can get it through Amazon. It gives lots of super, super practical tips. 10 things you can do that'll make things worse. 10 things you can do that'll make things better, that kind of thing in that early stage.
And of course, one of the things that we addicts have to overcome is that the other side of thinking that our spouses are going to fix us when we get married is that many of us do not believe we can live without them. So if they suddenly weren't here, they decided to divorce us, or they died, we would not know how to live unless we were married. And that's part of the addiction.
Right.
And so getting to that place is a difficult prospect for many of us. But you mentioned community, and it's practically instinctive for addicts to isolate. We're
right.
used to isolate. And on the top of being men, we can be double isolators. And I think you mentioned one family member, I think it was maybe your father, who was that way. But talk a bit about being in community, not doing it on our own, but living in community. You talked about support, and also working the steps as a part of your ongoing recovery, because the issues that come up, today are different than the ones that are going to come up 6 months from now or a year from now. And the steps we're going to have to work to get through those are going to be different. So can you talk about that?
I think you just did. You just mentioned all of the things that are important, but again, I think that the deep desires of our heart are for connection, they're for relationship, they're for community. So all these tools, working the steps and all of those kinds of things, are not just means to an end of sobriety. They are tools that help us be more authentic and healthy in community. And so I can't emphasize enough just the importance of finding your tribe. And of course, the easiest place is to find it in a ministry or a S fellowship dedicated to sex addiction. And then within that bigger group of tribe, finding your small handful of men for y'all and do life together, and for whom you really will show up for each other and support each other, and where you will be willing to be fully known, and they are too. It's so rich. It just makes such a difference in the quality of our lives, and it helps us when our partners aren't doing recovery the way we would like for them to do, or aren't getting over it the way we would like for them to get over it, or those kinds of things. You're muted, Jay.
Thank you. Appreciate it. We're talking with Marnie Ferree, who is the director of Bethesda Workshops. And we're about at 15 minutes left, so I'm going to go to some of the questions. If you do have a question, you can go ahead and put it on the chat function. One of our attendees says, did you say, quote, recovery process is unmanageable? And if so, what do you mean by that?
I may have said that. If so, I misspoke. Certainly our addictive process is unmanageable. Our acting out process is unmanageable. Though, now that somebody's saying that, I think some of the recovery process feels unmanageable. When I'm so used to trying to manage my own life, and now I'm doing steps 1, 2, and 3 about turning my life over to the will of a power greater than myself, whom we would call God and Christ, that feels unmanageable to me because that's just not how I'm used to doing it. To walk through the consequences, even in recovery, because the consequences don't end just because we're sober and we're in recovery, depending on the nature of our stuff. All of that still can feel unmanageable. So I guess there's a part of that that's true, but it's the unmanageability that has this goal in sight of creating not just sobriety, but integrity and deep relationships and health and authenticity that, and those things aren't unmanageable.
Hmm. I want to turn to the subject of your teen seminar, because many of us know people who have teens who are struggling with pornography. One of the realities of the development of technology is that we used to be able to take whatever machine we had and put that machine in the middle of the room in a public space. And now, of course, the machine, which is this, goes everywhere, right? And one of the characteristics that you mentioned in our previous conversation was that you require a parent to come with the teen to this seminar. So what are some of the things, the reasons for that, and what are some of the special dynamics? Because we know that in SA, for instance, you can't come if you're under 18.
Right.
So is it possible to have somebody who's under 18 being diagnosed as an addict? And how do we help teens with this problem? Because there are many. I was just with somebody the other day who works with kids, and he said the use of teen pornography is approaching 100%.
Yeah, I would
And
agree with that.
so how do we handle that?
It, as Dr. Patrick Carnes says, the tsunami is here. It's just unbelievable. And you're right, the smartphones and the technology connect us in healthy ways like this, but for so many people, it's a very different thing. There were a whole lot of questions involved in all of that. Yes, I think it's a good boundary that people have to be legally adults to be in a 12-step meeting, unless there's one specifically. There's AA has meetings for adolescents, and Alateen does too, and different things. I'm not aware that many of the S fellowships, at least they're not very prevalent, have them specifically for teens. So that's a good boundary. But of course, teens can heal. We don't diagnose teens and call them addicts. They will begin calling themselves addicts, but we carefully use the term problematic sexual behavior. And they might not meet the full criteria for addiction. And frankly, it doesn't matter, meaning they're having lots and lots of problems around technology and porn. And just the men whose videos are on who I can see, I hope I don't offend you, but y'all look a little older like me. And so you need to know that this pornography that the teens are looking at, this is not our kind of pornography. This is violent. This is misogynistic. It is incredibly demeaning. It is multiple people, but violence is the operative thing. This is the free pornography that these teens, actually that anyone could find. And so that's what their sexual appetite is being formed with, and it's what their expectations come to be when they're 15 or 16 and have a girlfriend. This is crazy on steroids from the stuff that our generation experienced. But we're still calling them problematic sexual behavior, just because that's really clear. We actually, Jay, require all the parents who are involved in this teen's life to attend a workshop with him or her. We have a separate gender specific program for teen female struggling with sex addiction. So we often hear, you know, maybe it's a mom and she's willing to come, but these very important men, well, I'm a so-and-so and I can't possibly take off work. She can just go. We're like, no, no. And for those kinds of people, we will refuse to treat them because this is a systems problem, a family systems problem. And unpacking what all that means would take a lot longer than the time that we have left. But this is a relationship problem and is largely born, I'll just say it, from less than perfectly healthy families, from family systems that are whacked out in different ways. Maybe a parent's an addict or impaired or in some way, but they have problems with boundaries and with roles in the family and with rules in the family and all kinds of stuff. And so this whole family needs help. It's not, think the AA Al-Anon type companionship. The wife needs just as much help. The issues are different. But within a teen, we have to treat the whole family system. Part of our thinking is also pragmatic. They're coming to us, they're staying 4 days, they're sleeping in a conference hotel. I know dummy, we're not putting 16-year-olds, even with a roommate by themselves in a room in a hotel. That's just not a smart plan. So families have to come. If there's only one parent involved in the teen's life, then that parent can come with the teen. But we're not letting somebody say that well, I'm what they're really saying is you just fix him. I'm too important to come. And typically, at least my judgment on that about that is you probably have a lot of issues yourself. And think about the message it's given to your kid that you're not willing to extend yourself to come. I forget what other parts of the question that was. Actually, we're having a very difficult time getting this program off the ground. There's a huge need. Every time I share about it, people are like, oh my gosh, this is such a problem and we really need this. And I'm talking with pastors, you know, I want to tell our youth pastor about that and talking with clinicians. Oh, I know all kinds of people who need this, and people don't come. And it's actually the parents who don't want to come. Now the teens are afraid, but when they hear we're going to involve the whole family and you're not the identified patient, you know, we're going to look at everything, all the dynamics in this family, then that helps them feel more comfortable. And by the time they get to us, they're really glad to be a safe place to dump all this stuff. But getting the parents to come, to spend the money, to the investment, to just be willing to show up. So we're trying to revamp this program actually right now in anticipation of next year. It's a group process. Again, group is hands down the treatment of choice for addiction. So being a part of this group and this organization of Living Without Lust is so important. It's group. And so we have done that in the past, 2 or 3 families at a time. And that helps take the pressure off one individual family. To have 3 or 4 families is best in terms of how all the dynamics work. But we can't find 3 or 4 families who are willing and able to come at the exact same time when they're scheduled. So we're trying to revamp it to see if we can treat just one family at a time, which is not nearly the best way to do this, but just to try to meet a need and then hopeful that will springboard us and get us enough momentum that we can go back to having workshops and multiple families will come. So there's a great need, and it's a very challenging and rewarding population to work with.
We just have about 7.5 minutes left. We've got a couple questions here. One I'm going to try to interpret. One gentleman says, you talked about being in community. He agrees with that. We need each other. He says he has a huge concern because his profession he works in, it would be very conceivable this would be used against me. In other words, if people knew his struggle, it would be used against him. Do you have suggestions how to approach this? I guess he means that how you be in community, like in your work environment, without this becoming something that could be used against them if people found out. I guess that's the question.
And even just the risk of going to in-person 12-step meetings. Usually for a meeting like Living Without Lust, it's framed such that that you don't necessarily identify yourself as an addict
Yes.
if you're walking in the door, which is very, very helpful, especially like the conferences and stuff, and support meetings or closed somehow. I mean, they're for people who are struggling. But to walk into a regular 12-step S fellowship, you might see your neighbor across the street, or you might see a fellow pastor or a fellow physician or business person or something. And so that feels a lot more scary. I have two answers. There's a part of me that wants to really kind of push back against the thought process and say, you know what, if you're seeing someone in a 12-step meeting, then y'all both have the same thing to lose. I mean, if both of you are really concerned about confidentiality, and there is a brotherhood of healthy privacy about anonymity about 12-step meetings. And I have found that is very, very rarely violated. Very rarely. So part of me wants to say, we have to be willing, 12-step language talks about go to any lengths. And I just don't believe anybody can recover without some kind of support meetings. I just believe that with all my heart, and believe in the 12-step programs with all my heart. So that's one side of the coin of go anyway and trust the outcome to God. And if it comes out, and trust that outcome to God. Now, on the other hand, I get some of the practical realities about that. And we hear this all the time at Bethesda Workshops. And again, that is a way that Zoom has been helpful. I'm sure that online meetings will continue after COVID's risk is gone and we can all meet in person again. And that's a good thing. So online, certainly on the phone, that's real easy. But even online, at the moment, I see the names of most of you, but you're aware that on Zoom, you can rename yourself. So if your name is Joe, you can become Tom or Steve or whoever you want to be. And if that's what you need to do to show up for a meeting and feel safe, you can do that. Most of you that I'm looking at have your video off. Okay. So you can participate in community without showing up in person. There's no substitute for in-person stuff. You have got to have a small group of men, 3 or 4, who know you and know your whole story. You just have to. And you can meet with them for coffee and be active in person with them. But in terms of all the other recovery work, you can do it on Zoom, and you can completely do that with anonymity.
Okay, this will have to be the last question because we're running out of time. Another gentleman says, you mentioned underlying issues that result in acting out sexually or sexual addiction. A friend of mine has admitted several times over the years that she wants counseling for this, yet she has not made the step. In other words, she hadn't gone yet. She's just talked about it. And the side effects of the underlying issues are very prevalent. Any advice on how to help her get there?
We see this all the time of people who are not doing things in their own best interest. And again, I believe that for all of us, there are underlying issues under our acting out. And so that's what I mean by might be sober, but not well. And sobriety is only the beginning point. I mean, to me, I really kind of look at sobriety, especially initial sobriety. It's kind of like that, again, whatever your faith tradition is, you're accepting Jesus. Sometimes that looks like baptism, that looks like different things, first communion, different things in different faith traditions. But that's just the beginning point. Then all the really good stuff happens around learning life differently and dealing with these underlying issues and all of that. So, certainly the question asker knows how important and helpful that is. And those underlying issues will continue to bleed out and make somebody's life unmanageable. Sometimes they may change from it's not now sexual acting out, but it's my gambling stuff, or it's my abusing alcohol, or it's just my rage, or it's whatever. And so none of that goes away until it's addressed. So all that's the truth. But the bad news is you can't make anybody do anything. And the only way that I know to help people like that is to have that honest conversation. I care about you. I have heard you mention several times that you're aware there's some underlying things. And out of love, I want to tell you, I see that. I see different ways that what must be lots and lots of pain is making your life still unmanageable or causing difficulty in your relationships or in whatever area you see it. And I just want you to know I'm really concerned, and I really beg you to honor yourself enough to do that. I fully support you. And then you have to trust that person's process, and often that might be, it's going to get a whole lot worse in that area before it gets better, but that's all that you can do. You could also, I guess, share, here's how doing that deeper work has really helped me. You know, I'm not as rageful, or I've learned to be much more responsible with money, or whatever. You can share your own experience, strength, and hope. 12 steps would call that, but you can't do much else.
You know, a lot of this, in my experience, is that we think that when somebody's life falls apart, that's the end. And you said the end is not the end, it's a new beginning. Sometimes that is the process God
Yeah,
uses to bring us to the end of ourselves.
right,
And so don't panic, because sometimes the disaster is not the disaster. There's hidden treasure in the midst of it.
right,
And we'll eventually see it when it comes out later on, and we'll say, that was what God was doing through that process.
right.
So, Marnie, we want to thank you for being with us. Thank you for your words of wisdom, for your ministry. Tell us how people can be in touch with you or Bethesda Workshops.
We have a very extensive website, so lots of free information, even if someone's not interested in attending one of our actual programs. Bethesda, here, let me put that in the chat.
And you can save the chat, I believe.
Workshops.org. And there's a contact us button on Bethesda Workshops, and you can reach us that way. There's also a different contact page that gives my particular email address, which is mferree@bethesdaworkshops.org. Ferree, 2 R's and 2 E's. So I would so appreciate y'all spreading the news about Bethesda Workshops for us and encouraging people to come online. We've done in person for 25 years and it's marvelous, but as Debbie Laser will tell you, they're completely online too. It is still extraordinarily effective. And in this crazy COVID world, people need help when they need help, and to wait for some magical time when we might be online, I think it's very foolish for an addict or a partner. So.
And we're all in this together, and we're glad to partner with Bethesda and to recommend it all the time for people to go. And it's been universally praised by people who have come back. They've said it's life-changing. I've had a guy come back from Bethesda, and he said, I never understood the gospel of Jesus Christ until I went to Bethesda Workshops.
Oh my.
And that is powerful.
That
and I have to say
chills.
that from my own experience, until I got into recovery, I never understood the gospel, because it's the new view that we see it. So Marnie, thank you so much for being with us. Next week, Debbie Laser, as she has mentioned several times, will be with us. Her subject is going to be how men can rebuild trust in their marriages. And I know many of us, again, don't know what to do because we're men and we're impatient and we think the process is not working, but there are things that we can do that will help to rebuild that trust. And if the love is there, it will be rekindled. So thank you all for being with us. We hope you have a great weekend, and we'll see you back here next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you guys. Many blessings to you all.
Thanks, Marnie. We'll be in touch.